Okay. Thanks, Sabrina. So as a reminder, as we think about public awareness in our meeting, last time we talked about all the cities that had been studied, and we talked about how public noticing is done. The emails, the website, the information, that sort of thing. That's the how. The when noticing is done, like before the planning board meeting, before council. And who is made aware, the distance, whether or not renters were included, owners, businesses, that sort of thing. So we're going to review that information today and review your feedback and the feedback we've heard from the community and focus groups, and then do some prioritization after we've had some discussion. As we go through that today, we hope that there's some difference in opinion. If we are really going to create some change, we will have some disagreements, and that's a good thing. And we'd ask for you to do two things. First of all, to honor what we talked about in the beginning and approach the disagreement with a sense of curiosity. I wonder why Joel thinks that. Joel, can you tell me more about that? Brendan, can you explain how that relates to your experience? Because it doesn't sound like it was the same experience as what I've had. So if we can agree to approach it with curiosity, can I see head nods or thumbs up from everyone that we can approach it with curiosity and with a sense of respect for each other? And secondly, I didn't get heads up or thumbs up from everyone. So I'm going to pause until I've got either head nods or thumbs up down below from everyone. Or you can do like Joel is doing, and you can show me a picture of your thumb. Perfect. Thank you all. And last time we met in April, there were also a few times we got a little heated with each other, which was great as we get through disagreement and come to some consensus. But we also want to avoid any personal attacks. Okay. And that includes attacks at cities, even our elected leaders. So if we'll just make certain we keep our tone one of we are working through hard problems together, that would be awesome. Okay, so as we go through this, Rob, go ahead and Sabrina, take us to the next slide. Rob's going to quickly remind us of the process and the research that's done, and talk for a minute about how people are being notified. Then we're going to stop and talk about that. Myra, criticism versus attacks. A criticism is, my experience was that this happened. An attack is, the staff go behind a closed door, they slam the door, and they lock me out. So a criticism is, it doesn't feel like it's an open process because of this. An attack is, they deliberately excluded me. Does that make sense to everyone? Any other questions like that? Okay, great. So Rob, I'm going to turn it to you to take us through the first section, which is about how people are notified and some of the background. So go ahead, Rob.
Sure. Thank you, Rox. Rox did a great job with a lot of the introduction on kind of how this is going to work. We're going to break this down into each of the sections. It'll be a quick kind of refresher on each of these topics. The three topics again are how people are notified, when people are notified, and who gets notified. We'll first start off by kind of taking a look at Denver's process. Sabrina, if you could go to the next slide. Before we do that, we want to kind of frame this discussion again around the issues and objectives that were identified during the previous phase of this project. So there are four issues that were identified that relate specifically to public awareness. So those are the noticing requirements that are not equitably accessible and use overly technical language, that the review criteria and processes are difficult to understand, especially for folks who are going through the process for the first time or maybe are not professional or zoning professionals. But there's inadequate language access in translation and interpretation, but then also just in our public notice and awareness materials and what's available on our website. And then lastly, the notifications to registered neighborhood organizations and the concern about the lack of representation in those organizations. There are two objectives that are also directly related to public awareness. The first one is to customize you asked, and we put together the goal and the objective to customize the rezoning materials and notifications for different types of rezonings. This would be specific to that notifications piece for different types of rezonings. Is kind of how we want to target the conversation today. And then we also want to improve public awareness and input opportunities. So kind of as we're looking at everything, kind of frame it around those identified issues and objectives. Next slide, please. So first, we'll take a look at Denver's process. Just a quick refresher on how Denver currently does public awareness through our current rezoning process. So there are kind of 3 steps, and we'll look at each one of those and how it breaks down and how we do notification at each of those steps. So the first notification goes out at the application submittal. So once an application is deemed to be complete, we send the postcard notice to property owners of real property within 200 feet of the subject property that is being rezoned. We also send an emailed notice to registered neighborhood organizations, at-large and district council members that have either their district or the registered neighborhood organization includes the area where the subject property is located. And then the third piece is we upload the application materials to the website, kind of generate a small web page around that rezoning application. Next slide. So after the application is submitted and during the review process, 15 days prior to the planning board public hearing, we send another postcard notice to the same folks, to property owners within 200 feet. We also send another email notice to registered neighborhood organizations, at-large and district council members. We update the webpage to include staff's recommendation and any public comment that has been received. And again, also 15 days prior to the planning board public hearing, a public notice sign is required to be posted on the subject property to increase visibility of that rezoning process. Next slide, please. And then the third step, and this is the final phase of noticing, the email notice is sent again to registered neighborhood organizations, at-large district council members. The application is again updated to include staff and planning board recommendations, as well as any additional public comment that was received. And then again, the public sign notice is required to be updated, showing the next hearing date, the city council public hearing date. So that's just a quick overview. And I think I'll pass it back to Rox or Sabrina.
Go ahead, Sabrina.
Next slide, I think, yeah.
Great. So we are just going to look now at the recommendations that we received from all of you in, before we took our brief break. And we have broken feedback from the task force on noticing into 3 categories: how, when, and who. So what we're going to do is just go over the feedback we've received and then do a brief Mentimeter to prioritize the recommendations. These, of course, aren't going to be like solid decisions where the lowest thing on each ranking is now not considered or put into action, but they are just but they will be used as a way to understand where the priorities of the task force are and respond accordingly. So for the how of noticing, we had themes around just providing more opportunities to receive notices for rezonings. Themes around distributing notices in more languages, considering how noticing is, being aware of different disabilities such as visual impairment, noticing being posted more broadly in public areas, using simpler language, and just considering other means or methods of spreading the word. So flyers, text messages, social media blasts, expanded website information, etc. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing briefly to give you the Mentimeter. And
Sabrina, no, we're going to have discussion first. So if you could
Oh.
leave those up so we can
Sure.
have some discussion first.
Absolutely.
So just as a reminder, currently it's postcards, it's email, it's web page, and then it's ultimately the posted sign notice. So Sabrina, if you can get back to showing this the
Yep,
screen, the
they should be coming.
recommendations. So you all were talking about more opportunities to receive noticing, more than a primary language, visually impaired, post notices in additional places rather than just the posted sign notice. And that in all of that the language needs to be even simpler. So what do you all think? If we did those sorts of things, would that increase equity in rezoning and how people are receiving notices?
Are we able just to comment, or do you want us to stack in the?
No, you, Anna, go ahead. And I can see you, and then I think it was Kate next.
Perfect. Okay. I think a lot of these are great. I apologize, I didn't have this idea until just now, but seeing post notices in public places such as schools gives me an additional thought of, as a former educator, it's important for me that the community is well educated on this topic. And it's difficult because our attention spans are 8 seconds. It's a really complex topic when we talk about rezoning, but I think it's important to include some blurb on how a rezoning can affect a community, the pros and the cons. Because I'm sure you guys have all been to a rezoning process and you've heard the same arguments. And many of these arguments I personally don't even agree with. And I think, like, for example, people worry about traffic increases with rezoning. And there's lots of studies that show that if we have more density in our cities, we have a better public transit system. It's complicated. So I guess my request is perhaps adding an educational blurb of pros and cons of a redevelopment.
Great.
Which
So
may be difficult.
Anna, that is perfect. And Sabrina is adding that. And when we get to a Mentimeter in a few minutes, you'll get a chance to see that's already been added to your ability to rank it as well. So I've got Lou, Kate, Bruce, and Brendan.
Okay, so I was just going to say, I know that we talked about some things that are like subcategories. And the last bullet, when we talk about expanded website information, one of the things that has dramatically changed is the ability to get information out there and to use web-based information better. And it seems to me that, especially if you could put a reader on, so anybody could just read the code, and it would and make it a requirement to be put on postcards, the notices, information that would lead to a information by the address at the city's website. I mean, we should be able to find the information more quickly. And then, for example, you could add more information on that, on the link, so that maybe you could, include the suggestion that you have more pros and cons of development, but it would take you right there. And it seems like getting the information out, making it easier to find, is key to this whole equity concept. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to, I think it was, that was Lou. So Kate, Bruce, Brendan, Brittany, and then Joel.
Sure, and I'm going to change what I was going to say because I really like Lou's idea. Because I was trying to figure out how you could get something out in more languages or to people that have difficulties either seeing or whatever, and maybe having that direct link could give you opportunities to translate, opportunities to have it speak to you out loud, whatever. Because I think that where it falls apart, especially, when I think about like the signs, I've been putting them up for years. And even I don't know what they mean. You know, I mean, I do, but it's very clunky. And so if instead there was a QR code or something on the sign as well, on the flyers, on whatever emails that go out, whatever, so that folks could just go straight to where all the information for the project is, and the whys for rezoning would be really helpful.
Great. I'm sensing some energy around that, and how we do this, it would be really helpful. Bruce?
Thank you, Rox. I really like the idea of the QR code on every communication, signs, mailings, postcards, emails, whatever, to make it easy for people to get information. A comment I have on posting notices in more public places, for example, is I think that we have to make certain that if anything's changed, that it's applied uniformly throughout the city, and that it's verifiable, and that that the requirements are this, kind of the same everywhere, so to speak. And so I worry, for example, with the public school idea, that if you, and I'm making this up, if you did the 2 closest public schools, but not a third, did you do enough? And, it'd all have to be, legally equal and verifiable, and in not put applicants in the position of, having thought they'd done the right thing, to then get criticized or have their projects be in jeopardy for maybe not having, for people thinking they hadn't gone far enough, if that makes sense. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Always being aware of unintended consequences and the legal requirements. And so I've got Brendan, Brittany, Joel, Floor, and Lindsay, and then we're probably going to need to stop for a minute and think about the polling. So Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on the website information. I'm putting in the chat what the city of Aurora has, but they have an interactive map that's publicly available on their website that breaks down developments real time. You can see what's being developed in opportunity zones and urban renewal areas and major development plans, master development plans. You can filter it by projects that have been proposed, that are approved, that are in construction, and it's all right there at your fingertips. And I think for community members to be able to have real-time access to the real-time development map in terms of what's in pre-application phase versus application phase versus approved, and also what are the underlying incentives that are helping to make these developments possible, I think is very critical in terms of transparency for the whole city. And so I would love to see us replicate and do something similar in the city of Denver.
Great, thanks, Brendan, and thanks for the link in the chat too, to the information. Brittany, and then Joel, Floor, and Lindsay.
Yeah, Brendan, thanks for that tool. That's a super powerful tool. And GIS maps, we have the data. So I think just that real time, just quickly piggybacking off, that's like just key of just, hey, this is what's out there, and it delivers the transparency. I would also, if there's a way to also collect feedback and questions in like the community, we do these different registries, but there's still not true ways to collect who those folks are, or even if they have questions, concerns, or feedback, a way to really collect and address that in real time as well.
Great, thank you. And Sabrina or Yvonne, did you see Londell's request? For some reason, he's stuck in the other room and I can't find him there, so great. Joel?
Yeah, thank you. I think the biggest step forward that has happened in the area of noticing in recent years in Denver is the postcards. But of course, that doesn't scale really well. It goes right to the people who live nearby, absolutely the people who might be predicted to have the most interest. But the next step, I think, really needs to be people being able to subscribe to notices about things that are of interest in their area. Right now, email is great because if you put a post somewhere, you're relying on somebody to walk past that post. If you put it on the website somewhere, you're relying on somebody to spontaneously decide to search a website. So email is great because it comes to you, but right now those emails only go to RNOs. Where there is an active RNO, and that active RNO in the best case is very inclusive and has a great way to repeat the message out to all the people in the neighborhood, it can work okay. But there are many places where there are other networks of people not connected to an RNO, whether or not there's an active RNO in the area. And if they could register, and perhaps a council office, is a great place to know who these networks of people are and say, oh, if you want to know what's going on, subscribe. They get all the same notices. It's not limited to rezonings. And we wouldn't just be relying on hope that there is a good RNO active and able to reach everybody in the community. So that being able to subscribe, I think, is really vital. And this is something INC has asked for. Secondly, I think the simpler language is just super vital. It'd be great to have a focus group look at a focus group of not me, of regular folks who don't deal with zoning very often, look at it and say, what does this mean, and kind of workshop what a better review, what a better notice is, that maybe says not only here's what's happening, but here's how it will be decided, so people can prepare. Oh, they're asking me whether it meets this criteria. Give that to me in plain English if I can know what the subject is. Thanks.
Great, we're going to go to Flor and Brittany, and then unfortunately we're going to close out there and go to some ranking. This is a great conversation though. So Flor?
So I just wanted to piggyback on the education piece. I think a link, like QR link, would be very helpful. And I think something that people need to know is like, what was the zoning, what would be the zoning, and like what would be the requirements. I think something that's important is to know, will this include like affordable housing? So yes.
Yes, and Lindsay, you're right after Flor. I thought I said that. So thanks, Flor. It's amazing too. I keep thinking about QR codes. One of the things that COVID really gave us, right? All those menus and QR codes, and now we're all so familiar with them. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think you said Brittany that last time. Sorry, I didn't know
sorry.
you were referring to me. So this is just kind of a general comment. I don't know if we'll get here at some point, but it's something I've been thinking about in terms of our approach to all of these questions, including this, who gets notified or how they get notified. I just think that if we're using an equity lens and we're really trying to be equitable, we really need to start thinking critically about the impacts of rezoning and redevelopment and how they differ by neighborhood. I just feel this talk, like we're talking like the way things are done. And well, I'm perceiving this conversation a little bit as like the way things are done is kind of consistent throughout the city, or the changes that we make should be consistent throughout the city. But I just think that the impacts of, for example, increasing or how we notify people, or doing it in different ways, and doing some of these things we mentioned will have such a different impact depending on the neighborhood. And I think neighborhood is probably a good like unit to measure how the impacts are different, how the impacts of rezoning and development are different throughout the city. So I just want to throw it out there that I think if we're really thinking about equity, we need to start thinking differently about neighborhoods and about impacts of some of these changes being completely different depending on where they're implemented. So that is my comment.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And when we get to the section on who, you'll see I've already added that thought too on the who section so that we can make certain we come back around to it again there. Because I think that you're capturing what a lot of people were trying to express last time about, there are differences in neighborhoods, and so I've added it there as well. So with that, Sabrina, get us through our first Mentimeter so that then we will go from the how. From there, our next topic will be when. So go ahead and do the Mentimeter for us on how.
Great. So here you are. I'm going to put a link into chat, and you can either use that link to load up the first question, or you can type in the code. If you go to menti, menti.com, you can type in the code I just put in chat. So either will work. And you should be seeing the first question called How Noticing Occurs. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Fantastic. So you should, how Mentimeter does ranking is you should see the first statement, which is provide more opportunities. Oh no, I'm sorry, I have it mixed up. You should see a box that says first, and then a drop down with all of the different options. So we have 8 things in this one. And once you complete that, second, third, fourth, etc., will pop up, and you can just rank from 1 to 8.
And Brendan, we didn't separate out the live website. It is in that in terms of using make information. So Sabrina, will you want to explain exactly where you've got that one?
Yeah, so that I had in make information easier to find online, using QR codes, etc. It seemed like while there was a lot of discussion around kind of how or what information specifically to put online, that all of it really fell into the category of streamlining the information available online and making it easier to find. So I put that there, but of course we would clarify what all we were actually talking about as we move through this process.
We've got all the notes of all the additional great content you gave for those ideas.
Yes.
And again, we're not getting rid of any ideas today. We just wanted to get a sense of where you all feel on these and how you feel about these.
Quick question. I might have missed something. We're voting on the communication piece of equity and rezoning, correct? That's it. And we're like moving on to another voting thing. I simply asked because I really liked Lindsay's point of different needs in each community.
No. So let's get really clear about this, Anna. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is only about the how of noticing. Next, we're going to talk about the when of noticing and the who of noticing. And keep in mind, this is just like, if we want the staff to explore and come back with some ideas, please put your energy here first. We're not getting rid of any of these good ideas or making them go away. We're just saying, let's focus here because we think these are really good ideas.
And we currently have 14 responses in, so we're just going to spend a couple more minutes on this. And thank you all for getting your responses in.
Sabrina, I think we're pretty close because I don't think the CPD staff or the Strategy with Rock staff are doing this. So we've got like 16 people total.
Yep. And we are at 16 now, so we can move on.
Lindsay, we agree it's not a separate discussion. That's just where we were putting it for the purposes of ranking. It absolutely everything, and all of these go together and they're very much intertwined with each other. Okay, so Sabrina, do you want to show us just where we
Yes. So here is our first round of ranking. We had making information easier to find online, that QR codes, regularly updated websites, etc. Although I'm jumping down to third here, we also had used simpler language and explained the process for input really highly ranked, which I think also really folds into that first, the first statement. For second, we had distributed notices in more languages, which again really does fall into that goal of making information just easier to access. And then for fourth, we had provide more opportunities to receive notices for rezonings in areas of interest. I think in the spirit of time, I'm just going to read top four for all of these, but everyone just take a moment to read the rest of them.
Yes, it looks like there's a lot of energy around the thoughts that you had about timely, accurate, and making certain that it is easily available, and when you are accessing it, that it's been updated and is current, and is in languages that are readily available to folks. So knowing that, let's do a little more work on when people are noticed. And yes, there are some of these that could absolutely be combined as well. So Rob, you want to talk to us about when people are notified of rezonings?
I sure do. As soon as the slide pops up, I'll get started.
So as you remember, there were all these cities that we talked about the last time, and this is a great reminder of all those cities. Go ahead to the next slide, Sabrina.
Yeah. Thank you, Rox. Yeah, I can jump in here. So again, this is another slide we've seen before. We're taking a look at this as a refresher. So we looked across the country at all these different cities, and looked at their different zoning codes or land use ordinances or whatever they had, in order to kind of break down and see how see when mailed notifications are sent, right? So this is very specific to only mailed notifications. This review didn't include any email notifications or sign postings or anything like that. But what we saw is most cities notice twice. The majority of these cities notice prior to their planning board or their version of planning board, and then again prior to the city council hearing. Denver, along with some of our peers, noticed earlier in the process, first at the submittal of the complete rezoning application, so that folks can be aware and get involved earlier, and then again at the planning board hearing as well. And this was very intentional. It's important to note here that in 2018, we actually updated our mailed notice requirements, and it was very intentional that this happens at the as soon as the formal application is submitted and deemed complete, so that anyone who's interested will get that notice and be involved earlier in the process rather than waiting until the hearings are scheduled. But again, we see the majority of folks, or majority of cities noticing twice. We can move on to the next slide. And then again, just wanted to highlight that even though we only notice at the application submittal, once that application is deemed complete, and then prior to the planning board hearing, that we also have other notification requirements beyond the mailed postcard notice that occur at all stages, and then at that final stage 2 prior to the city council public hearing. So even though Denver doesn't send the mail notification prior to the city council public hearing, we do post the sign, post an updated sign on the property, and update the website and send the email notification to the registered neighborhood organizations and council district members.
Okay. So let's assume that we have already incorporated all your other feedback. Sabrina, go ahead to the next slide. And we've really thought about how the noticing is done. So there's a lot more of it already being done, a lot more ways to get the notices. They're timely. You've got the QR codes. The question is still, when should the noticing occur? And this is the feedback. So we're gonna go and walk people through the feedback that they gave us from before.
Sure. So we just had 4 really major themes here. But again, of course, a lot of this, almost all of this has significant overlap with every other part of it, right? It is all different sections of the overall concept of noticing. But with that being said, we heard that there should be improved noticing at the pre-application stage, required noticing prior to all public hearings, which is actually already required. Additional, just expanding the mailed notice prior to city council meetings, and holding additional neighborhood meetings outside of the existing R&O neighborhood meetings. And we would love your thoughts on how we really define or how we would run that. So with that, we'll go to discussion.
So let me start with, we don't know, of course, from the jam boards who had the idea. Does anybody remember or key off of neighborhood meetings that are beyond the registered neighborhood organizations? Are there thoughts on what that might be?
I'm thinking that they could be at like public places like the schools or the library.
And would those be meetings that you were thinking, Flor, or were you thinking that those would be postings?
I don't know who or when this was suggested, but I don't think it's a terrible idea because I do think that neighborhood meetings aren't very equitable in general. So I think it would be nice to have a meeting to talk about the development of the area. Where that ties into like the neighborhood plans and things, I don't know, but I do think just relying on R&Os isn't equitable.
Great. So additional public meetings, looking for them, finding them at schools, that sort of thing. We'll go to Anna, Lindsay, and then I've got a second Yvonne that I'm not certain who it is, but when I get there, I'm assuming you'll know who you are. So Anna, Lindsay, and then Yvonne.
Hi, yes. So I actually also struggle with the idea of how to engage the full community outside of the R&O. I assume the best way would be to email PTOs, perhaps religious organizations, nonprofits in the community that are active. I'm sure many other people have better eyes than myself. What I wanted to say about the on noticing part of this is one of my biggest concerns with our rezoning process is that parts of our city are being rezoned much more frequently than other parts of our city. And so I honestly wonder if on the when, that if, and I know many people are probably going to disagree with me, should neighborhoods that have historically not been seeing a lot of rezoning, should they receive the same notice, the same timeline? Should they be given it the information at all? I mean, surely they should be given it, but like at the same rate. That's my concern.
Great. So kind of getting at what we were talking about before about the who as well, is where there is disparate impact that would need to be defined, but defining disparate impact, or then having some different ways to help those neighborhoods know. So we've got that. Going to Lindsay, and then I lost my second Yvonne hand, so that I don't know if that's Bruce. So Lindsay and then Bruce.
So I agree that we should explore that conversation about how notices can look differently in different communities. In terms of ideas for different organizations and R&Os, I also agree that R&Os do not often represent the people who will be negatively impacted by a rezoning or by development, or just in general don't necessarily represent everyone in the community or all the stakeholders. I think that there are a lot of community-based organizations, nonprofits, just kind of like grassroots organizations that could probably be added to the list of organizations that host meetings and are notified And for an idea of finding these organizations, I guess I just think of, how you found all of us. You just ask what kind of organizations want to be notified, who do communities themselves see as leaders and representing themselves. And I think there's a lot of organizations out there in different neighborhoods that work closely with their communities and want to advocate for their communities in addition to the RNOs. So maybe just asking.
Great, these are great ideas. Going to Bruce, then Caitlin, then Joel, then Lou, and I'm afraid at that point I'm going to have to cut it off again, which I hate to do.
This is Bruce real quick, and I think it's very common and happens often where there are neighborhood meetings and public meetings, and they're noticed by mailing, and you can go out, well beyond the 200 feet that is the postcard requirement, and that good applicants are doing this and realizing that they need to go beyond the RNO and get in direct contact with neighbors. Flyers, mailings, all those types of things work well. Are we only talking about this fourth bullet point, the neighborhood meetings, or are other topics on this slide up for discussion right now?
All are up for discussion, Bruce.
Okay. I'm opposed to notification at the pre-application stage. The pre-application is an informal kind of exploring ideas and a chance for applicants to learn about the process and how and if their ideas conform with adopted plans and meet city policy. And as we discussed last time, only a portion of pre-apps ever become actual applications. And there at the time of a pre-app, there is no project. And so I just think that it's wholly inappropriate to have any notification at the pre-app stage.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Caitlin, then Joel, then Lou, then Lindsay, then Brendan. And Alfonso, I'm going to come to you, and then we really are going to have to go on to the next section.
Hey, this is Caitlin. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think some of this is kind of the when, but also touches on the who, like who is the host of this meeting, right? And maybe that's some of it is in other cities, for example, like the city is more of the host, right? The city puts on this public meeting and it notifies on the website, on flyers, etc. But the developer or the applicant may present at that meeting, but the host is more the city rather than the RNO, or maybe in addition to the RNO. So that's just a thought on kind of like who facilitates that meeting in addition to the public meeting and the location.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. And City, could you just give us some guidance if you want us to rank that one or not? Could you just let Sabrina know in chat if you want to include it in here or where you want to include it, because it's a great idea. Joel?
Yeah, thanks. As you said, it wasn't that long ago, 4 years ago, that the city added notification as soon as a complete application is received. And that was a huge step forward. Prior to that, if an applicant was good and reached out to people, you would hear about it earlier. Otherwise, you just hear about it when the official notice saying there's a hearing coming up is, and that's not long enough. And so that was a huge step forward. I agree with Bruce to push it even earlier when someone's just having a conversation with CPD for pre-application isn't a great idea because what do you notify people about? There's a discussion. They haven't decided whether to apply or not. They haven't decided what to apply for. And I think to give a sense of that, Andrew, thanks for replying in chat that just a small proportion of pre-application reviews that ended up turning into applications. I did have a thought on the neighborhood meetings, and I think this agrees with what someone said earlier. I think it may have been Lindsay who was talking about, this is about the when, but I think it does shade again into the who. If there's going to be other discussions held where the applicant comes and it's held and it's not specifically an RNO, how does that get instigated? How does it happen? It can only happen if those other groups got the notice in the first place, and just reinforces the need for groups to be able to register to get notices that aren't necessarily RNOs, and we don't make them masquerade as RNOs just to get notices. Anyone who wants, any group that wants, should be able to get them.
Great, thank you. Lou?
Yeah, so I'm interested in just taking this concept of the RNO and the quality in the RNO one step further. And that is that, you know, Denver, like other cities, has this structure in place that's really built around the RNO. And the RNO is supposed to be there for everybody in the neighborhood. Everyone who lives in the RNO boundary are members. The city was undergoing a review and updating of the RNO process. It seems to me that, you know, unlike LA, where the RNOs have even a more important position when they do rezonings and other city action. Ours is sort of this, you know, is it a quality RNO? Does it really reach people? Do they have good outreach? Do they have a website? It seems like the city that was reviewing the RNO ordinance should maybe look at trying to help those RNOs that are not up and running or don't reach people very well, and help RNOs be the, you know, fulfill the role that they're supposed to fulfill. Because I think if you get too many, you're going to start putting people in different silos, and the RNO is supposed to bring people together. And I think that maybe we need to think about some work around that. It's not that hard to do a website. It's not that hard to do a YouTube channel, as I found out, where you could have information from the RNO meeting put on that link that you can get when you scan the QR code. So there's a lot of ways to strengthen that without losing the intent of the ordinance, which is to bring people in that neighborhood through an RNO system as a way to make sure everybody gets the information about what's going on in those boundaries.
Thanks, Lou. And I remember at one of our community meetings, we heard from a couple of RNO leaders who said they really need help and they could use help with language capacity, outreach, websites, many of the things you're saying there as well. Brendan and then Alfonso. I think you're on mute, Brendan.
Yeah, I just want to make a very strong pitch for improving noticing at the pre-application phase. You know, I don't agree that nothing happens at that phase. I really think that at the pre-application phase is where you see the intention of the developer. You know, they're coming in with a vision that they're vetting with the planning department behind closed doors. And my understanding of the process is that by the end of that conversation that happens behind closed doors, as Bruce said, informally, you know, there's pretty much an alignment between CPD and the developer about the fact that this project can move forward and it gets the tentative green light. And at no point is there any community engagement or participation in that process. And that feels extremely inequitable. You know, we as community members don't have that ability or that money to be able to sit down with CPD behind closed doors informally and envision about what we want to build in our neighborhood. And, you know, by the time the fence goes up, usually it feels like from the community perspective, most of the decisions have already been made and the green lights have already been given. And so I understand that not all pre-applications become projects, but if we're talking about transparency and equity and intent, it's very important for us to know what the intention is at these pre-hearings that are done behind closed doors. It's very important for us to know what the intention of the developers are in the neighborhood. And my question would be like, why not? Why not? And it doesn't have to be maybe a blanket notification like some of the other notifications, but at the very least, I think groups should be given the opportunity to opt in and to be notified at the pre-application phase. And this is something that the city, had done previously through the host and the NEST meetings that were happening, where they were proactively notifying us of pre-applications. And that's something that has already been vetted and been shown to work and been extremely helpful for community groups that want to make sure that we have a voice in what's happening in the neighborhood. And so I think that's one of the most concrete steps that we could take to equalize the playing field so that everybody's in the loop around conversations that are happening before green lights have been given to the developers.
Great, thanks, Brendan. Thanks for sharing your perspective. If we really want to change things and make it more equitable, we may have to stretch how we think about some of this. All right, Alfonso.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to second what Brendan is saying about the importance of pre-application, because although maybe the number is 20% actually move on to application, the intention of a pre-application is really, I mean, from my understanding and from my experience, is so that the application can meet the requirements that the city. So by the point that it gets to the application phase, it means that there's a very good chance that it meets all those requirements, quote unquote, to pass a rezoning. So the pre-application is a very important phase in that process, as well as I would just say anecdotally, a lot of the successes in our community over here in Global Swansea, in being able to more positively interact with the developers is because of pre-applications. It's because it hasn't gone to the point of submitting an application in all its formality. It's because a community will be able to have more broader input into what will go into the application in the first place to meet those requirements. So I think that's one of the most important phases, if anything. I definitely don't agree that it's unnecessary or not justified. I think it's the most justified at that point. So I definitely wanted to uplift what Brendan was saying with that. And the second thing that I wanted to say is definitely this idea of opting into notifications. I mean, it really isn't that complicated. I like what was shared earlier with, what's capable with GIS and ArcGIS maps, which the city already has a database for, has a department for. And people being able to opt in would be really important because also RNOs aren't really responsive to, the broader community, and nor am I a fan of the idea of like basically asking them to like formalize themselves even more and adding this extra layer and support and technicality to it for some RNOs that aren't really at times as well. They're aged out of the reality or aren't a reflection of the current community. And so yeah, and I'm seeing a comment here that no green lights are given at pre-application. Yeah, I know that's the point. Is that they need to understand what they're putting in the application. But anyways, I digress. And just the last thing is that I think that if it like cost is an issue in terms of like notification, I do like the fact that it's been recently pre-application and application notifications, but getting away from the RNO structure would be really beneficial, and opting in potentially would also be an amazing change. welcome change.
Great. So as promised today, we have some disagreement, which is good because some people feel like the process isn't a closed process and that no green lights are given. And other people feel like that is really a place where there are green lights given and that there's different perceptions. And a lot of what we need to think about here is how do we build trust that we have an equitable process and then make certain that it is an equitable process from there. So it's good to have differing opinions on perceptions of what happens. So Sabrina, I know you've been taking a lot of notes. Why don't you show people the notes and then we will go to some polling. Again, it's just a straw poll. So Sabrina, you want to show us some of the notes you've been taking so that people know? I think you might have to refresh first.
Yeah, looks like it. So give me 1 second and we will be able to see that.
So the problem always with doing a Mentimeter is we cut it down and we want you to make certain that you know that we've gotten a whole lot of additional information.
Yes.
And so, yeah, so go ahead, Sabrina.
So, I mean, we won't, a lot of the conversation that expanded on the initial 4 bullet points was added to our Mentimeter that's coming up. But I just wanted to show the more exhaustive notes that we were taking in this discussion. As a brief aside before we go into the Mentimeter, the pre-application conversation we've been having is really bundled into that first bullet point that we see on this slide. So when you're ranking, when you're thinking about pre-applications and the noticing around that, this first bullet point will be the one you are ranking on. And I'll give you, half a minute or so just to look through this a bit more, and then we will go into the Mentimeter.
Let's go ahead, Sabrina, just because of time. And I always hate to cut off good conversation, but we also want to get through with some of the next section.
All right, so if you click that link, or if you left your Mentimeter open, it should have moved on to the when noticing occurs.
Let's take down the slides too and put it in again for folks.
There you are.
There we go.
And I just dropped those in, so please let me know if you have any trouble accessing them or if it is working as it should.
And just so folks know, I know there's quite a bit in the chat too. We do also capture that.
All right, we have about 7, 8 responses in so far. So we're just waiting for about 8 more to come in, and then we will move on to the final section or set of proposed recommendations. And we're at 13 now. So we had 17 on the last Mentimeter, which is what we are shooting for right now. We're waiting on 2 more responses, and then we will move forward.
Our next topic is going to be moving into the who. So it's a topic that, as we saw earlier, has already started to weave into all of our conversations because it's a fabric underneath of it of who's in the neighborhood, what's already happening to the neighborhood. So let's quickly look at when, and then we'll move to moving on to the who.
And so our highest ranked option for when was the ability to register to receive any rezoning notices occurring in the city. So in theory, through the CPD website, you could put your email in and get all notices in the city. Then we had neighborhood meetings being expanded beyond RNOs. So leveraging community spaces such as schools and libraries to bring in a broader range of community members. We then had improved noticing at the pre-application stage. And as Roxanne said, there is quite a bit of a discussion going on while voting was occurring in chat about that. And then fourth was having additional mailed notices prior to city council. And in the spirit of time, I will now go back to sharing the slides.
Okay. And with that, we're going to go back to Rob too, as soon as the slides come back up.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Rox, and thank you, Sabrina. So this last category that we'll take a look at, final category in public awareness, is who is made aware of rezonings. Next slide. We just have two slides here. This first one here shows to whom mailed and emailed notifications are sent. So this actually includes both, depending on where cities had certain requirements, but it's inclusive of mailed and emailed notifications. So if we take a look at these, you can see that again, the majority of cities or all cities send a mailed or emailed notification to property owners. 6 of these 18 cities also send a notice to occupants or residents. So this includes Portland, Austin, Texas, Los Angeles, Boise, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco. So this is an advantage for tenants of residential and commercial properties to also receive notice. And then there are also 12 cities that send a notification to the registered neighborhood organization or neighborhood association, or whichever their similar equivalent is. So next slide, please. This slide shows the mailing radius for notifications for rezoning applications. So again, this is just for mailed notifications again. It kind of really shows that there's a really wide variety of mailing distances. For example, Nashville, Tennessee, and Fort Collins have the largest radiuses with 1,000 to 800 feet from the subject property. However, the majority of cities notice between this 300 to 500 foot radius from the subject property. It's also so important to consider, the impacts of the number of people who are getting these rezoning notifications. All these different cities have different, average lot sizes and things like that. And there are also some cities, it's not shown directly on here, that vary their noticing distance based on the type of rezoning, and in some cases, it's based on a potential for different types of impacts. So that's our quick summary on who gets that mailed notification. On the previous slide, they mailed and emailed, and pass it back to the Strategy with Rocks team.
Great, thank you, Rob. We'll jump into the feedback from the task force on who to notice, and then, as with the other two, go into discussion and then voting. So we had feedback to include residential and business tenants in mailed notice. So, residential renters as well as businesses near proposed rezonings. Just as a blanket, expanding noticing to everyone with an address in the neighborhood. What went along with that was skipping down to the final bullet point. Potentially using census tract data to just determine bigger zones to do blanket noticing in. There are also the desire to expand noticing to capture people who are not active in their RNOs. So again, a lot of overlap with the previous two sets of recommendations. Expanding noticing around the proposed rezoning just to a larger radius. So to the last slide Rob was talking about. And then we just kind of had more of a theme of asking, how do we prioritize and engage underrepresented groups? So that can be tenants, non-English speakers, potentially looking at census tract data to help determine that. And then kind of a question of, should there be differences based on neighborhood needs and impacts, which sounds very similar to, I believe, the comment Anna made earlier on the first block of recommendations. So with that, I'll hand it over to Roxanne for discussion.
So just as a reminder, this is about, what is required for noticing. We always hope people do more than what's required, but this is what is the bare minimum that's required. And should there be greater minimum requirements? Liz, did I catch that correct from your thinking, or is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thank you for reinforcing that. I think the expectation and the encouragement that happens from staff is that people go well beyond this, particularly for certain neighborhoods and certain cases, and that's often demonstrated and asked about at city council and planning board. So this is just the reminder that this is what the code requires right now currently, just keeping that lens. So there's probably many things that we do that are not required that maybe we should consider going forward.
And Sabrina, if you'll make certain that one of the things we also pull on is that piece of differences based on impacts and needs of the neighborhood. Because we've heard that in every single area of really making certain we understand what's going on in the neighborhood. And then are there ways to do things specific to high impact neighborhoods and neighborhoods that aren't getting the notices, that sort of thing. So what do people think? Are there additional ideas on this? Go ahead, Anna.
So really quick, just before I kind of give my comment, it's about this, how do we prioritize engagement of underrepresented groups? When I was a teacher, we did this exercise where people received a card that said, I have cancer, I have a bee sting, I have a cut, I have nothing wrong with me. And the option was, the difference between equity and equality. I'm sure we've all heard this, and everyone received a Band-Aid. Obviously, most of the people did not benefit from the Band-Aid. Now, we're acknowledging this by looking how we can prioritize engagement of underrepresented groups. My question is, how do we manage engagement with overrepresented groups? Because a Band-Aid given to somebody who has nothing wrong with them is one, worthless, but in this case, talking about equity and rezoning, I think harmful. And so that's why I'm really happy to be a part of this group, because these are concerns and questions I have. I honestly don't understand, we can't say we're not notifying this neighborhood of a rezoning. That would never be okay. But I don't know. I just worry that a lot of the engagement that we might be doing for underrepresented groups will be misused by people in overrepresented groups.
Thanks, Anna. I think everybody understood, at least I did, your example there, and it was a good example. Kate?
I think I have a similar but different path than Anna, but the concern is the same. As Habitat, when we are engaged in a rezoning, we tend to host community meetings that aren't required, just to try to talk to the community and understand what their issues might be. We do, we'll walk around the neighborhood with the neighbors to understand what they like and don't like about their neighborhood, what they want and don't want in their neighborhood. But if we had to send cards, pay to send cards to the entire, neighborhood versus those maybe directly impacted, as a nonprofit, that becomes potentially a very expensive proposition, and also potentially brings in more voices that are further out that actually may not want affordable housing. We've had that happen to us as well. And so I just think we have to be careful. We're trying to help those that are sort of underrepresented. We do only home ownership programs. So I know there was a comment, I didn't read the whole thing, but about tax credits or something like that, but that's not us. And the process of trying to create affordable housing can be really divisive. And so we do sometimes prefer to engage just with the neighbors that are close to where we're going, and in many cases those who have invited us in, and not have to fight with folks that are a mile away who don't want it. So just a different spotlight maybe.
Well, I think you're pointing to two really good things. One is the unintended consequences and being aware of those, whether that's cost or not being able to get through needed projects that are city priorities, that sort of thing. And the other is how exactly public input is used. And I just, hate to say this, hold on tight, folks, because in July, we're going to be getting to how public input is used. And I promise you, we're going to have a fun conversation on that topic. And by fun, I mean we're going to have some difference of opinions, and it'll be an engaging dialogue, I'm sure. So thanks, Kate. Joel?
Yeah, as someone who was active in INC zoning and planning during the time when the city added the mailed notice, which I was really happy about, because it can break through the assumptions about, if we pass this to this group, then they're certain to pass it on to everybody. I'm really disappointed to learn that it only goes to property owners. If somebody would have asked me last year, I would have said, yeah, everybody within close proximity, a couple 100 feet of a rezoning gets notice. And when I said everybody, I wasn't discriminating based on how they paid for their lodging, right? If they own the place and they're paying a mortgage, or if they rent, 50% of the people in the city do rent. So in my opinion, that is the key thing that has to change here. If the address of the property owner is different than the address of the property, they both get a postcard, right? And yes, in areas where you've got multifamily apartments and whatever, that's going to be a lot more postcards, because you need one for every apartment or a condo or whatever. But that's the most important thing I see on this list. And again, if you would have asked me a year ago, I would not have guessed that we weren't reaching half the population who's renting.
Thanks, Joel. I think that's a really highlights that first one, tenants, whether you're a personal tenant or a business tenant, you may not currently receive the notice. Brendan, and then Brittany, and then I'm going to ask if there's anybody else who hasn't had a chance to raise your hands today, who wants to make certain before we do some ranking. Brendan?
Just want to name that it feels a little bit weird, like how all those bullets bunched underneath that last piece, just because I feel like a lot of those are pretty significant recommendations around languages used, around tenants, differences based on neighborhoods, needs and impact. So I'm just not quite sure how to vote on this one. So any guidance would be helpful.
Okay, Sabrina, why don't you break those out? We were trying to categorize those from everything that you all had given us earlier, Brendan. So that's on us, and we can easily make those include tenants. We've got tenants up above. But but Sabrina, if you could break each of those out, that would be great.
So we actually originally didn't include that bullet point in the Mentimeter for that exact reason. Since residential tenants were in the first bullet point, is there a specific part of that that you want included in the ranking, or?
Let's make it prioritize underrepresented groups, tenants, those of diverse languages. Use census data tracking to prioritize underrepresented groups, and then differentiated based on neighborhood needs and impacts.
Sounds good.
Great, thanks, Brendan. Brittany?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure who said it earlier. I think notifying the resident and occupant is really important. Once again, that's the eyes and ears of what's happening in that neighborhood and area. In our business, I handle a lot of relocations, and like, right, just of general, occupants are like, hey, the property sold, or there's a road going in and I no longer can live here. I'm getting so many of those on a daily basis. And we, I think we have to be intentional, and we have to give people a chance to prepare for whatever may happen. And if we don't do our due diligence, we are really creating trauma out in the community. And I see it on a daily basis. It's already stressful to have to just move or have a change in the community in general. So I just think if we want to integrate some trauma-informed practices and that community piece, I think it's super important to notify those occupants, and then also to have a way to be able to capture any feedback and in an intentional way.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts, particularly from anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak up yet? Okay, Sabrina, how are we doing on having a poll ready for us? I know you were making some edits just then, so if you need another couple minutes, go ahead.
We are all good. I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and we will do the third round of voting. So again, that link should still be active, or if it is still in a window on your computer, of course, you can get started now. If not, here is the link again. And we ended up with 10 options for this. So it is a bit unwieldy looking at it. But just ask for clarification if anything doesn't make sense, and I will be happy to provide it.
Brittany, you have a question?
I think your hand was up from before, but I'm not certain. Brittany?
Sorry, I meant to put it down.
Okay, got it.
And the good thing about these 10 is some of these overlap. Don't worry about them overlapping. Again, we're not taking them to eliminate ideas, that sort of thing. We also wanted people who aren't as likely to speak up to have a chance to weigh in some of where their energy is.
What are trauma-informed care practices?
So I'm trying to remember who talked about that a minute ago.
Brittany.
Brittany, could you remind Bruce of what those are?
Yeah, I'm a social worker by degree, but no, just like when I was just making the point in general, when we're notifying, like the importance of notifying the occupant or tenant, and not just like after the rezoning happened, or there's no place for them to, I guess, like, I I'm trying to explain trauma-informed practices, but the point that I was trying to make with trauma-informed practices, I really want to make sure that tenants and occupants of that area are notified. And if there's a chance of displacement, which oftentimes happens and is currently happening, that we need to be aware that that could be a potential thing that could happen to that occupant or tenant, and being aware of that. And I just think, once again, allowing time for people to prepare if there's going to be a relocation or a move or a change, giving space for them to express that, and being aware that that change can affect their mental health, can affect their livelihood, and just being aware of that.
Thanks, Brittany. I'm
Thank
a
you.
social worker too, and I think you did a pretty good job of that.
I got
Just-
nervous.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How are we doing, Sabrina?
We have 12 responses, 13 responses, and are waiting on around 16, 17. And once we get one or two more in, I will share my screen so we can take a look at how the ranking is being ranked. And if a few more people want to submit their responses while I'm doing that, that is of course okay.
And Sabrina, we lost two people who had to leave early, so that may be part of the difference as well.
Yeah, we're at 15 now, so I'll go ahead and share the results of this Mentimeter. And if another one or two comes in, that is great. So, and we'll look at a few more than the top four since there are 10 options here. But we had first prioritizing underrepresented groups for language diversity. That mirrors feedback we've heard in the other sections. And then we had the residential and business tenants being included in mailed noticing. We also, for the fourth option, had prioritizing underrepresented groups for residential tenants. So that's really reinforcing the second one. In third place, we had noticing based on the needs and historic inequities of neighborhoods. So considering potential impact of rezonings, that could fall in line with the comment earlier about assessing rate of noticing as an option. Jumping down to fifth place, we had again, assessing noticing based on neighborhood needs and potential impact. So that's duplicative of number 3, but does underline how important you all thought it was. And then looking at things like census tract data to ensure those underrepresented groups are being noticed, and expanding noticing beyond RNOs were 6th and 7th.
Great, thanks, Sabrina. If you can go ahead and take us off a screen share now. And so I'm sure everybody saw exactly what I see in this is we see from the very first all the way through the end a number of common themes. How do we make certain we do real time, more languages? How do we really think about these issues of disparate impact on disparate neighborhoods? How do we make certain that we're reaching all people who are immediately most close by impacted and in the larger community impacted? So thank you, because we're not getting rid of any of your recommendations. We wanted to see where the patterns are so that we would have a sense of where to really focus some of our time and energy and work in these next steps. And I think you all have made it pretty clear of some common themes throughout this process today. So let me stop there, and Liz, we'll go to public comment in just a minute. I'm not certain if we have anyone for public comment or not, but Liz, thoughts from you and the CPD team.
Yeah, I just thank everybody for the really good discussion today. I think a lot of these ideas had come up kind of briefly in our discussions before, and we wanted to provide more space here to have more in-depth discussion around them. So I appreciate kind of the just the more back and forth and ideas that came forward. And like Rox said, I think we are separating these out into topics, but we know that they all overlap. And I think definitely that theme of, whether we tailor our ideas based on neighborhood, by impacted residents or businesses, and maybe the type of rezoning, I think is something that will continue to get weaved through this discussion. So just appreciate that, and for your kind of patience and understanding as we make the project manager change too in the next couple of months.
So great. On that note, we'll go to public comment, and if there isn't any, then we'll have a chance for task force members to talk about more things. But are there any public comments? Sabrina, I'm not seeing anyone. Are you?
No, we are a meeting of panelists today.
Okay, great. So I know there was a lot happening in chat as well. Does any of our task force members, are there any other things you want to raise today? Anna?
Sorry, I actually have nothing to raise. I just know there was a lot of chatter in the chat. If we still have about 15 minutes, I really would love to hear it maybe more out loud, so we can discuss it if you're comfortable.
That's exactly what I was getting at, Anna. So thanks for also encouraging your peers to, anybody want to talk about anything you put in the chat where you'd be willing to speak up about it? Flo?
So one thing that I was thinking is about all of this notice and how much voice do people have once they do get noticed? Like, I know there's like a hearing, so they have to schedule their whole life to attend like this one hearing at one time on one day, which is very inequitable. Just curious about that.
Thank you. I think, Liz, if I'm not incorrect, we're going to try to go over what the process is supposed to be, and how it's supposed to be. Doesn't always mean that it works that way, at our next meeting, and then start to make some recommendations about that. So that will be our July topic, because we know sometimes, at least in the community meetings that I've attended in the past, it's sometimes what it's supposed to be doesn't always feel that way in the meeting. So what's the process supposed to be, and then what's happening, and then what's the perception of what's happening as well, because all three are equally valid. Joel?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on that and bring up something I brought up in one of our first meetings, and that is, I think we should study what Lakewood did on a number of dimensions, because they, the process, the technical process of rezoning is quite similar, but they really focused on simplifying the language, making it clear what's being done, pre-recording a video of the staff member explaining what's the current zoning and what are they proposing and what would that allow, and what are the plan guidance, etc. Same thing that staff presents at public hearings now, but you don't have to wait for the public hearing. If you're someone who just got the notice, you can go watch that video. And then an ability to leave comments right there, not getting around to writing an email or as Flor said, scheduling your life around going to a meeting. You can leave your comments right there that become part of the public record. And it has reminders right there of what is the criteria, so you can focus your comments on that. So I think it'd be super neat if we had like a 20-minute presentation to this group by the director of planning from Lakewood, and have him show off what they did. The key thing that sticks with me is their diversity of participation went way up. It's a relatively white community, I understand, but it was relatively just older folks who participated in the past. And when they implemented these changes I just talked about, people of all ages, all stages of life, all employment versus retirement, etc., started participating a lot more. And we can steal good ideas.
Great, thanks, Joel. We've got a couple of great things coming forward today, both from Aurora and from Lakewood. Lundell.
Yeah, so I guess I wrote a few comments in the chat, and I don't know if they can really be answered or addressed. It's more, I think, me posing questions because of frustration. One is related to the pre-application phase. It's, whether or not, there's green lights given or what have you, from where I sit, there seems to be just this persistent pushback of having community members in that session. And I'm just really always just curious as the why for that. I mean, what I'm hearing is there's no reason for community members to be there. Instead of, well, there is nothing going on, and if you want to be there, well, let's figure out how you can be there. And then secondly, what also kind of perturbs me is this idea of some neighborhoods being able to, because of their affluency, say, not in my backyard. I get it. When Denver was small and there was little population, and again, I've been here for, well, anyway, I get it. But this is a growing major metropolitan city, and to have spots within a major metropolitan city that have these lovely single family homes, that is becoming kind of irrational thought and an assumption. And like I stated, the city itself and the council people themselves need to develop a stronger, and as I said, a backbone in saying, I hear you, but we can't continue to put these types of homes in this particular area because you just don't want it there. And the converse of that is looking at where all of this development is happening and saying, we can't continue to put this type of development in these areas because we're displacing people, whether or not it's through zoning, whether it's not, however it's happening, it's happening. It just doesn't seem to be much, there seems to be a lot of, I don't want to step on anybody's toes things, and the people that are getting stepped on are those that don't have the affluence. And people will say, no, that's not the case. But the proof is looking out across the city landscape and seeing where people have opportunity and where people don't have opportunity and how they get that opportunity.
Thanks, Lundell, for bringing your thoughts to the whole group. And I see some head nods and some agreement happening and so I think that for us, one of the questions we have is, if using your analogy of a backbone, how do we create really strong recommendations that help people have a backbone, right? And how are we going to do that as this group? Any other comments or thoughts? As always, we also welcome your input and your thinking back on how the process went today. But before I do that, feel free to put that in chat to us as well. Flor.
Just one more thing. When we had talked about the notice during the pre-application phase, something that wasn't really talked about was that the fee that pays for that notice comes in later. So how would we absorb that cost? And I definitely am not against having notice at that time, but maybe making it public was one of my suggestions. I just think that's something we need to think about for the future is if if there's a cost with it and it's being absorbed by fees and we don't have a fee in the pre-application phase, what would that look like?
Right, so aligning our fees with costs in a way that doesn't further create inequity. Great. Anything else? Anything people would like to give in terms of feedback about today's meeting?
I just will say that I appreciate the opportunity for more discussion.
Thanks, Lindsay. Saw some head nods on that as well. Anything else?
I just want to lift up that I think it would be, I feel like we're like, we're getting a lot into the details, which is important, but I also feel like it could be helpful just to walk through some case studies of how this is played out, especially in neighborhoods that are at risk of displacement. And, have some conversation with community members that have been a part of those rezonings, both sides, right? But like, I just feel like maybe grounding us in some like concrete case studies that we would be happy to send some ideas your way, could just provide deeper context and get us less out, out of the process, and into like just the practice and how it plays out. And it might be helpful for the committee. So just wanted to suggest that.
Thank you.
I have volunteered to make either rezonings that I've completed and or rezonings that are underway available as case studies for this group. And so if that's something that people are interested in, I volunteer again.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay. Anything else from the group? All right, we will see you in July, but thank you all so very much for the good conversations today and the disagreements and the themes that emerged. So thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.